This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing, with discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, I am pleased to welcome with us Jim Vesper. He's currently Director of Learning Solutions at ValSource. It's great to have you here, Jim.
Thank you. Nice to be with you as well, Stacey.
Absolutely. So today we are going to talk about root cause investigations for CAPA. I know you just finished a book on that topic and do some webinars and other learning opportunities for folks. And I think it's a really important topic, continues to be a really important topic in industry. As we see 483 and warning letter citations, they continue to be the cause of them continues to be for inadequate investigations. This can include incomplete or lack of investigations, failure to determine the root cause, inadequate corrective and preventative action, and lack of documentation, and a whole host of other things. And we know that regulatory agencies use the investigation reports and investigation trends to identify potential quality issues across the organization. And having a procedure on nonconformity or deviation investigations isn't enough. I mean, there needs to be a lot more done. So I'm hoping that you can kick us off, Jim, by talking about the reasoning for such an emphasis on investigations and corrective actions, and what current guidance should we be aware of? Sure.
I think, the current emphasis has really been for quite a while. And regulatory agencies have been asking for this. If you read through the USC GMPs, there's some specific requirements. The European regulations are even more detailed about what they're expecting to have in a deviation investigation. I think some companies look at it as just a compliance issue. We want to do an investigation just to check the box. But I think some of the more progressive companies are really looking at this as a way of how can we improve? Where can we get some knowledge about our process, some understanding because of this failure that we hadn't had before? And how can we get back into a state of control?
And so really, I mean, does that then, would you say, for regulators become one of the most important areas of focus for them when they are doing on-site investigations or visits?
Yeah, I think so, because it's really a place where you can see all the pieces that are coming together or that they're not coming together.
Sure.
For example, what some inspectors do, what some auditors do, is they say, okay, give me a list of all the investigations that you've done, all the quality failures. They go through the list and they say, that looks like a really good one. Give me all the pieces now. And they start pulling the strings. Okay. And it can take that inspector to go a lot of different ways. So that's really why they're so important during the course of an investigation or inspection.
Very good. Very good. And what tools can be used for investigations? Beyond, we hear the 5 whys and the Fishbone diagram, but I know there's a lot of other things, a lot of other ways, a lot of other tools, I should say. And what value can these alternative tools provide?
Yeah, if you take a look at what is being used in the industry, I train a lot of people, hundreds of people on investigations, and you ask them, okay, what are the tools? And 5 whys, Fishbone diagrams are the ones that always come up.
Right.
But there are other tools like fault tree analysis. There are tools like chronologies and sequences where you can take a look at a timeline and what was the timeline compared of this unwanted event to what a desired state is, to be able to look at that. Doing observations, critical observations in an area, spending time looking, doing structured interviews, Those are all some examples of tools. And then you can put those together with some other tools that look at failure sequences and failure chains. And what that allows you to do is really to look at that incident from different points of view. And those different points of view can give you a better insight as to what really the root causes and contributing causes were.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the use of various tools for CAPA analysis? And I'm just wondering if there's such a thing as the rule of three that many companies seem to think exist.
Sometimes I hear about the rule of three of like with validation, and you do three and you have a lot of confidence, and yeah, you can, but it really goes to the fact of how were those validation protocols set up and how was it actually done. But when you take a look at some of the deviations that occur, you're wanting to really go into detail for each one of those, particularly for those significant deviations. And what the tools allow you to do is to collect the evidence. So often we just focus on the symptom. How did this show up? Right. And if you focus on the symptom, you're putting a Band-Aid on the problem. But when you go to a root cause, and a root cause is something that you can actually take action against, that's where you can have the benefit and find a way of preventing it in the future.
So what constitutes an acceptable root cause? What about human error? If human error is not a valid root cause, what is it, right? Yeah. And then what should we focus on as an organization?
Yeah. When you talk about root cause, a root cause is something that you can actually take action against. It's in the purview of management and the organization to do something about. So that's what you're really looking for, something that is actionable that you can take. If you have human error, what that really is just a category. You can't take action against it. You get rid of the people. It's as similar to saying that you have a failure in a process due to equipment failure.
Right.
It doesn't give you any information. What you want to do is to be able to dig deeper. And when we talk about that category of human error, what we're really wanting people to do is take a look at human factors. What are the things that caused or contributed to that? The areas that have done, the domains that have done the most work in this are aviation, nuclear power, the space industry, because they have really developed and improved on some of these tools and applied these tools to really understand what is causing this. What are some of the things directly and indirectly that are causing this unwanted event to occur?
Right, because even with human error or human factors, for example, those errors are usually caused by a lack of process or, a vague process, or someone wasn't following the process or something else like that. So you're saying, if I hear you correctly, you're saying then you focus on those actual root causes, like updating your process or having better training for your personnel if you're finding human errors to be an issue?
Yeah, an example, I was working on a project last year and watching people document things in a batch record. And in the batch record, it said verify. But what the people were doing at the end of the day is they were just passing papers around and signing these papers. So I started asking people, what do you mean by verify? And everybody came up with a different answer. I went to the company's procedures. There was no definition about what verification actually is. They didn't do any of that in their training. So you have to sort of start pulling those strings and ask, why are you doing this? Do you understand what you're doing this? And there may be some very structural issues that are really underlying the problem that you have to address.
Understood. So, and you mentioned training. I mentioned training. You mentioned training as well. Why are training and revise the procedure used so frequently as a corrective action then?
Yeah. I'm a trainer and I love training. And it's going to be, though, the most unreliable, the most expensive solution to any type of a problem, because a lot of the issues really don't have the root cause of training. And if I see a company that does a lot of training, retraining, if they do a lot of, revise the procedure, to me, it's an indication that they didn't do a good root cause analysis. They just sort of are skirting over what the real issues are. Because training would only be a valid corrective action if you can show that there's a deficiency in knowledge and skills. And oftentimes there are other things, like the example that I gave on verification. Somebody had no real definition of what verification means. So you have to really probe more. So like I said, if I see that retraining and change the procedure is being done too often, I really question the aggressiveness and the robustness of their investigation process.
Sure. And so, so what could they do better, right? I guess that's what you work with them on. Like, how can we complete a better investigation and avoid using the same terminology over and over again and really never solving the problem?
Yeah. So if there's an issue related to human error, if that is the category, if you see that people are involved in that particular unwanted event, there's some different models that are out there. One is called the Human Factors Analysis and Classification System, or HFACS, been used by the aviation industry when they have a safety event. And what it is are different levels. It's a hierarchical model that allows you to really dig down. And if you go to that base model, it's looking at things. Is it a violation? And is it a routine violation? Is it an extraordinary violation?
Sure.
And if you see that somebody's violating a procedure, you have to ask why. Most people don't violate a procedure just to violate it, but they're trying to sometimes balance. Okay, I have all this to do, and I have this to do. I'm not going to be able to get it done, so let me take a shortcut.
Right.
So you sort of have to sort of probe and ask some of those questions as to, why are you doing this? What other things were you doing at the same time? Are you multitasking because you've been assigned too many things to do? So it's asking some of those questions to really help you understand what is really going on. Sure.
Yeah, and you need that look from all sides, right?
Yeah.
To be able to really hone in on the root cause, as you mentioned. How does risk-based thinking apply to investigations in CAPA?
Mm-hmm. Well, all the GMPs around, the European GMPs, USC GMPs, are thinking about risk and some of the guidances that FDA has adopted from the ICH. And what those guidances are saying is that all unwanted events are not the same. There are some that are more significant than others. So you can use risk-based thinking to do a triage. Is this a thing that you can address immediately? It had no impact on the characteristics of a GMP product, being safety, identity, strength, purity, and quality. No issue on data integrity. It was corrected right there at the spot. Okay, take a note of that, because that could be a flag. That could be an indicator that you have an unwanted problem. But on the other hand, if you have something that is a failure for a critical process parameter, a CQA, okay, you need to dig into those more deeply. So one way of using risk-based thinking is in the triaging. And a lot of companies do that. They have a decision tree that they use. But also as you're thinking about the corrections, the corrective actions, to think about what added risks might this correction have? Are there any residual risks that we put in? Thinking about what is the risk to the patient? What is the risk to drug availability?
Right.
So thinking about this in terms of scope and impact is a way of using risk-based thinking.
Which makes total sense. I mean, the whole industry is really risk-based model now. Most decisions that they make are based on risk and priorities. And so that makes total sense that it would follow through in investigations in CAPA.
Mm-hmm.
So Jim, once we've taken the steps to really dig down and identify the root cause, what are best actions to correct and remediate? And what is the best way to determine the extent to which the failures are now under control or whether additional action is still needed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two questions there. The first one is...
Two-part question.
Yeah, the first one is, are the corrective actions that you're going to take, are they aligned with the root cause? So the more you know about what that root cause is it an issue with vendors? Is it an issue with specifications that they're not clear enough? Is it an issue with resources and not having enough resources? So it's really requires you and the investigation team to be honest and to take a look at really what are the root causes there that are actionable. So if you have an alignment between the root causes and the corrective actions, you're going to have a more successful solution. Your second question then was, how do you know if it's working?
Right.
And there are a range of tools that you can use, or a range of approaches. If you have something that doesn't occur very often, maybe it's the first time that you've seen it, it was really serious, in terms of likelihood of it happening again, it may not for quite a while, just naturally. So you're not going to want to wait, for 2 or 3 years to say, yeah, it's been effective. So there might be some other actions that you can take. We call them indirect measures to be able to look at that. What sort of indicators can you have? This is where qualification and validation come up, because those are indirect measures to show, yes, this particular solution, it's working, and we have evidence of that. We might not have evidence that it's actually prevented that problem again, but at least we know that this action that we took is qualified, it works as intended.
And that's perfect. Thank you for that answer. So for listeners who want to take, it's all about having the right plans and making sure your processes are accurate and kept up to date. Really, I hear that in many different departments across the industry. So for our listeners who want to take action today, Jim, what are the must-haves or the building blocks for an effective CAPA plan or risk-based CAPA process?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most important things is that leadership of an organization needs to see the value in this. They need to give people the time. They need to have the resources to do good investigations. Now, one of the things that we know from other areas for investigations outside of the pharma industry is known as the golden hours. And that's the first 24 hours after that incident. And if you go more than that 24 hours, you're going to be losing evidence. People's impressions of that event are going to change.
Sure.
Their stories might change. So having leadership that says, yes, when this event happens, investigate it immediately. Don't wait till that end of that 30-day period, because in that case, you're going to lose a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the information. So having leadership that is really bought into this is important. Another thing that we see is what's called psychological safety. And we've seen a lot of this in the research that's been done in healthcare settings with nurses, and with doctors. And what psychological safety is that a person feels comfortable about raising their hand and self-reporting.
Okay. That makes sense. Right.
Yeah. So, the organizations need to think about how are they providing that psychological safety to people that, you don't immediately get beat up for reporting a problem and self-reporting a problem. So that's the thing that, again, it's part of the culture of the organization. Leadership has a big role. I think a third thing is making sure that people know that there's a toolkit out there of these different methods of doing an investigation. They've been trained on that. Maybe having a mentor in the organization that can provide coaching and support. So it's part of that, it's really part of that infrastructure. It's not just doing the investigation, but it's this infrastructure that can really help and contribute to a good solution.
How effective do you think we are right now across the industry at doing those three things? Is it something that you see commonly organizations doing, or is it something where you feel like there's still a lot of room for growth?
I see that there's a lot of room for growth. What I see is islands of success. One group that I worked with, they had a culture, they called it a no blame culture. And in terms of psychological safety, they were really good with that. On the other hand, they didn't use a lot of the other tools. They were still using the 5 whys and root cause or Fishbone diagrams for a lot of their work. So I see pockets of things that are there that show that, hey, they're wanting to do the right thing, but I think we have a long ways to go. And I think one of the indicators of that is how often human error is considered to be the root cause. Like I said earlier, if people are saying it's human error and we're going to retrain, it shows that they really don't get it. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. One organization I worked with up in the Boston area, they realized that they had some deficiencies in these writing and doing the investigations. They spent a lot of time training people, and in the first year that they actually had this program being used, they saved about $12 million in work in process. They were able to shorten the time of doing the investigations. They had good investigation reports that didn't go round and round and round and round and get churned between the writers and quality. They were able to really increase the first time right, and they saw what it meant to their bottom line. So it really does have an impact to the organization if you do this right.
Absolutely. And I would think that most organizations want to do it right. And that's why they are retraining, right? But so is it because the training is not effective training? Or, I mean, I understand they don't really understand the root cause, which is, so are they just training on the same processes without making changes? Is that what the issue is? I mean, I'm just trying to understand where training would be, would result in failure, because so often we hear that we need more training on certain aspects of the business. So I'm just trying to kind of hone in a little bit more on that gap.
What you sometimes see is, okay, we're going to retrain somebody on the procedure, and it was a read and understand procedure at the beginning anyway. They give somebody the procedure again, and really, what good is that going to do? So could be, the procedure is out of sequence. The procedure doesn't have some of that information, where people really weren't trained on, how do you actually do this in the first place? So you really need to go back to that root cause and say, why is this happening?
Right. And that makes sense. Thank you for the clarification. I just wanted to make it clear because, so many times organizations do think that just training is going to solve the problem. But you need to train correctly, I guess, and understand, what was the cause of the breakdown to begin with. So I know we mentioned some tools, including the 5 whys and the Fishbone diagrams, as well as many others. Jim, and I mentioned right at the beginning that you have spent a lot of time researching and facilitating a new book that'll be coming out. So for our listeners, can you just briefly tell us what kinds of tools and tips they can get from that publication?
Sure. It's a book that PDA is going to be publishing, talking about investigations and CAPA. And what we do in the book is I take people through a 14-step process. Everything from observation of the problem all the way through to monitoring and review. So it's really taking people through the process. A big piece of it is with the focus on the tools. What are some of the tools that are used? What are some of the ways of doing an interview? There are some methods that are used that were developed for law enforcement, focusing on witnesses. And how do you get that information from a witness that's really most reliable without influencing that interview through leading questions? So we talk about that. We talk about observation. There's a section on critical thinking. And what are some of the questions that if you're doing a review of an investigation report, what are some of those questions that you should be asking in that? So it really takes people all the way through the process. It gives people on some details. There's a section on facilitating. If you're facilitating a investigation, either remotely, using Zoom or something like that, or face-to-face, gives people some information on how to be an effective facilitator.
Excellent. Very important tools and some guidelines there. And we would love to link to that. Is that book available or is it yet to be published?
At least right now, towards the end of June, I got an email from the editor, Amy Davis at PDA, and it is being printed this week. So
Excellent.
it should be available in the next couple of weeks on the PDA bookstore.
Fantastic. We'd love to include a link to the bookstore for our listeners in case they want to check it out. Sounds like a great tool to have in their back pocket.
Yes, I think it will be.
Awesome. Jim, as we wrap up for today, what other closing thoughts or tips would you like to share with our listeners?
I think one tip or one thing to think about is it takes time to do a good investigation. You can't, whip it out in an hour or two. Some of these long investigations, especially a micro investigation, it can take months to actually do. So you have to be prepared for that. Also, as you start doing more and better investigations, actually the number of investigations and the time that you spent, it's going to go up. There's a hump there. But as you get to the root cause, what you're able to do is to turn those off. And then over time, you should have a lot fewer investigations. So investigations are an investment in the knowledge of your process, in process understanding, and in the long term of saving money and saving time. Sure.
That makes sense. And you have to dedicate not only your team's time and energy, but it sounds like, it's a lengthy process. So you have to have some patience that goes along with it and diligence.
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, I thank you so much for some great information, Jim. And I'm happy to share the book as mentioned. So we will include that, listeners, in the show notes if you want to take a look at that and make some good use of those tools.
Great. Thank you, Stacey.
Thanks so much, Jim. Thank you again to our guest, James Vesper. And I also want to give a big shout out to Ben Kitchen, our producer, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. For today's show notes and including a link to Jim's new book on CAPA, root cause analysis, we will include that in the show notes, and you can find that at www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with more great interviews and ask you to make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.